What's going on, everybody? Thank you so much for joining us here on episode 98 of the 90 Feet from Home Fantasy Baseball Podcast. I'm your host, Joe Orrico, and today we are going to be tackling the Keystone. We're looking at second base tiers, starting at the top, working our way probably beyond the top 30, but that will be the range that we are really focusing in on today, 1 through 30. Taking a look at the RotoWire Online Championship ADP over the last couple of weeks, if you guys want to follow along. And I have a fantastic guest. I believe it's the first time we've done a podcast together. I could be wrong because you lose track after all the years, but I believe this is the first time we've been behind the camera and behind the mic together. We did get to hang out a little bit at First Pitch Arizona. I was able to meet this fantastic gent who works over at RotoWire. You can find him hosting a lot of their podcasts, doing a lot of stuff in terms of rankings. There's all kinds of RotoWire content coming out for Mr. Erik Halterman, who you can find over on Twitter at Erik_Halterman. That's Erik with a K. Erik, thank you so much for making the time today, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me on. It was great to meet you in Arizona. I spent some good time together. I don't think that we hosted any podcasts together while we were there, but, we were hanging out late in the night. You never really know what happened. But looking forward to this one. We got a weird position, I think, second base this year. I don't know when the last time I've seen a position with so few players near the top of the draft is.
Yeah, there's not many of them, and the ones that are up there tend to be a little bit older. Marte, Altuve, Semien. There's a couple of guys who are a little bit younger, but yeah, it's a fairly weak tier comprised of some guys who are already on the wrong side of 30. It's kind of an interesting position to break down, even from a dynasty point of view. But today we're going to be looking at it just from the redraft side. And before we dive in, I want to remind you guys about our sponsor, and that's BetOnline, the most trusted world betting platform and your number one source for online betting in 2025. Whether you're a seasoned fan or a first-time bettor, BetOnline is your ultimate game day companion with the largest selection of odds on everything from the NBA and college basketball to the NHL and UFC. BetOnline continues to be your number one sports betting source. From every three-pointer to hat trick, BetOnline has you covered with odds, stats, and more for every game, every play, and every win. BetOnline, the game starts here, and what also starts here is our second base preview, and we are going to start right at the tippy top here. Again, if you want to follow along, we're using the NFBC's RotoWire Online ADP. It works, having Erik here from RotoWire, and we're going to be looking back from February 19th until today's recording date, which is March the 5th. So the top tier is Ketel Marte, Jose Altuve, Ozzie Albies, Jordan Westburg, and Matt McLain. They do stretch from around pick 30 to around pick 80, sometimes a little bit after with Matt McLain. Erik, considering the scarcity at the position that we've both kind of alluded to, do you find yourself wanting to target one of the elite tier second basemen in most of your drafts?
I think generally not. I think a lot of the guys at the top of the second base rankings this year, they're moving up because there's nobody else ahead of them. I think it just feels wrong as a ranker or as a drafter to say, wait a second, we've gone through 55 picks and we've only put down one second baseman. We got to slot those second and third second basemen in here somewhere. You look at where Jose Altuve and Ozzie Albies are going late 50s. I don't think it's crazy, but I think they're getting a bit of a boost just from their position. And I'm not sure that's correct because while second base is thin at the top, as we're going to get to later in the show, I'm sure, there's tons of options who are acceptable. I don't think you're going to get stuck without a second baseman who you even view as a viable option, which could happen in some other positions, like, say, third base. I think there are maybe some cliffs where it goes from, all right, I don't mind having this guy. I'm not excited, but I don't mind, to, wait, I really do mind, pretty quickly. There's a lot more guys at second who I don't mind. So I don't think you have to push up Altuve or Albies just because the position is weird this year. Same with Ketel Marte. Now, I don't think any of them are crazily overpriced, but they're getting a boost from their position, I believe, that doesn't necessarily need to be there. Unless I'm missing out. I mean, are you targeting at least one of them?
I've landed on Altuve and Albies a couple of times, but generally speaking, I'm shopping for different things in those first 5 rounds. I'm looking for my closer. I'm looking for a lockdown ace. I'm looking for foundational pieces on my offense. And it's not to say that Altuve couldn't be a foundational piece of your offense, but the way that the Astros lineup has kind of gone downhill a little bit, I think that they made some good moves. Walker and Paredes are nice additions, but they are not Kyle Tucker and Alex Bregman. So I think he's losing a little bit of shine there. He's also getting older. The multi-position eligibility that's coming with Altuve could be a little bit interesting, having infield and outfield, because it looks like he is going to be playing in left for the Astros. But there is something that is a little bit hard to trust at his age, especially with the metrics. But with the metrics, I guess Altuve has kind of always outperformed them. If you're looking at the career he's had based on his stature and everything and his hard hit data, you probably wouldn't have expected that he'd be on the Cooperstown course. So I almost want to give him another chance and let him, have a bad season before I'm actually willing to say that I'm out on him. But I think it's not crazy to say that I'd rather be out a year early than a year late on a guy like Altuve as well.
Yeah, and something that hasn't been mentioned much with his move to the outfield, it's been talked about as this selfless thing that Altuve was willing to make way for some new signings, or if he needed to bring his buddy Alex Bregman back, I'll move to the outfield because I'm such a great guy. And, maybe he is, but also he hasn't been very good at second base the past 3 years, and he's now 35. You know what happens to players when they become 35 and they've been falling off in the infield, in the middle infield? They move to the outfield. Jose Altuve, if you look at, say, DRS, he's been worth -15, -13, and -13 runs the last few years. Outs above average, he's trending in the wrong way as well. UZR, he's been actually slightly better this past year. But in general, I like to look at all of the defensive metrics together and see a pretty clear trend. And Altuve is getting older. He's getting worse. He's getting worse at the plate too, right? He had a OPS north of 900 for 2 straight years that dropped to 790 last year. So being out 1 year early rather than 1 year late does make a lot of sense. Although, again, as you mentioned, it is Jose Altuve. He's been able to stave that off pretty well. I don't hate the pick, but in the top 4 rounds of a 15-teamer or the top 5 rounds of a 12-teamer, you want your players to have less downside, and there's some real age-related downside with Altuve, even if we haven't actually seen too much of that on the field just yet.
Yeah, it's hard to disagree there. I have, I think, 2 shares out of 16 or 17 drafts, and I think that's probably enough for me. It's not going to kill me if he really does fall off, but I do want to have just a couple of shares just in case I'm wrong there. But somebody that I'm really fading in this top group is Ketel Marte, and I might be on an island there. I know a lot of people are still very interested. When you're looking at somebody who is in their 30s, coming off of a career year where the price is as high as it's ever been, for me, that's generally speaking going to be a fade. I can understand people want to buy into the gains and the barrel and hard hit rate, and they might have been legit, but I don't really want to find out in the second round. He's only had one other year that even close or kind of resembled this, and that was the bouncy ball 2019 season. So am I crazy to kind of fade Ketel Marte there in the second round, Eric?
Yeah, I'm not on Ketel Marte in the second round either. It's just the inconsistency throughout his career. You mentioned he had that good year in 2019 where he had 32 homers. If you look at, say, by WRC Plus, he was at 150 that year. He actually was at 141 2 years later, but only over 90 games. He battled some injuries in 2021. He's back at 151 this most recent season, although missed a little bit of time last year as well, 136 games. He's just not been somebody who's consistently giving you 600 plus plate appearances that are the same as what he gave you last year. I mean, he's only twice even reached 600 plate appearances. So a very talented player who deserves to be going in this range in his best years. I mean, if you drafted him at this spot heading into last season, you would have, I think, still probably made a profit. Just doesn't have the year-to-year consistency, and now that he's heading into his 30s, he's not that old yet, but age 31, you figure a little bit of a decline is to be expected. Just not somebody who I want coming off his best season. I would have hoped that the market would have remembered his inconsistency, and then you could still get him as a potential bargain in the mid to late third, but that's just not what's happened.
Yeah, I was really thinking the third round pick, like his max over the last couple of weeks is 37, which does get there, but this is a 12-team ADP, so it's the fourth pick or the first pick of the fourth round where he went in that particular room. It's not the norm, though. As you see, the minimum pick is 16. A lot of people are taking him in the middle to late part of that second round, and for me, it's just a little bit too rich. I'll let somebody else take the chance. I understand it. Like, he had a great year. It's a great offense around him. Arizona led the league in runs last year. But it feels a little bit too risky in the second round. Westberg and McLean are the last 2 guys in that upper tier. You kind of alluded to there being some price gouging a little bit in the market here. These guys getting pushed up a little bit higher than they should. Does that include Westberg and McLean in your eyes?
I really like Westberg in this tier, but I like him because he plays third base. And I think third base is a tougher position to fill out late in the draft than second base. So I have actually drafted Westberg in TGFBI recently, even though he is dealing with some back concerns. The fact that he was said to be getting back into game action later this week expected to come Thursday or Friday as we're recording this. I decided that was good enough that he's still fine to draft. But Westberg has been pushed off the draft board, I think, over the course of the winter. And it's because people are realizing third base is tough. And I think some people are pushing up second baseman as well. I think Westberg, a totally solid hitter, not really necessarily a future superstar, but I'm not too worried about the crowd in the Orioles infield. I think Westberg is going to rise above it and play all the time and give you very solid numbers and be able to be plugged in at second or third base, which means also middle or corner if something really strange happened and you already had a second or third baseman by this time. So the positional flexibility, basically he fits on everybody's team, and that's why he goes so high in ADP is there's nobody by this point of the draft who couldn't use Jordan Westberg. So you got to pay up to get him. I don't think he should rise much more because, again, he's not that amazing of a talent. He's just such a useful role player that I think the price is actually still okay. I just think you're probably using it as your third baseman.
That's totally fair. Yeah, that I understand. I don't think I've landed on Westberg. Maybe once or twice I have. Honestly, I forget. After I've done drafts going back to November with gladiators and everything, I kind of have to look back at the player shares because a random gladiator on a Tuesday in November, it's kind of hard to remember who I drafted.
Yeah.
But Westberg is somebody that I do have some interest in. He's not like a big fade. He's just not somebody that I've actually clicked draft on. The price going up has definitely been noticeable. I think without looking into it earlier in draft season, he was somebody you could get closer to pick 100, and now that's very close to pick 75, essentially right there. Matt McLain is an interesting one. I don't really know what to make of him exactly. He wasn't this expensive earlier in draft season for sure. He wasn't the top 85 pick. But I think people are dreaming on what he could do in a full season in Cincinnati. What he did in 2023 was fantastic, but I don't really know how to evaluate Matt McLain properly heading into this season. What about you, Eric?
Yeah, I would say neither do I, which is why I haven't been drafting him. If you've got to pay up in the top 100 for a player that I'm not feeling all that confident about, I'm going to let somebody else do that. The problem with McLain is he wasn't a fully proven player even before the injury. He showed a lot of promise, certainly in 2023, but it was less than a full season, just 89 games. And there were some red flags in there, mostly just his strikeout rate was quite high at 28.5%. I wanted to see over the course of a full season, how's the bat going to hold up? Is he going to get found out a little bit? Or is he going to settle in and lower that strikeout rate, right? So you could have seen that jumping to 31, 32% over the course of a full season, and then he's almost definitely not a top 100 pick. Or you could see it drop into 24, 25 as he gets more major league experience, and then he's a bargain. I don't know which way it's going to go, and the fact that he had an entire lost season means we just didn't have the chance to find out. I think of, say, like O'Neal Cruz, who showed a bit of flashes and then missed an entire season. He wasn't quite ready to, I think, continue that trajectory immediately in that first season back. I think he was probably a little bit overdrafted there, and I think we could be seeing something similar with McLain. Love the talent, and he may well be a bargain at this price. He's got the talent to do it, but for myself, at this range of the draft, I want to see it first.
I completely agree. I think that there is some Zach Geloff type of potential where we saw half a season, people bought in heavily, and then he fell on his face a little bit. The strikeout rate was a little bit too high, like McLain. So, you never really know how to extrapolate when a guy's done really great things over 80 to 100 games. Is that just who he is? It's hard to say. And paying a top 100 price, yes, the multi-position eligibility is nice there, second and short, but it just feels a little bit too expensive pushing a top 80 pick at this point. Okay, that's the first tier done with. Let's move on to the next grouping here. 6 through 10 is Marcus Semien, Luis Garcia, Bryce Terang, Luis Rengifo, and Xander Bogaerts. Eric, is this a range that you'd like to be shopping for your second baseman in?
Yeah, there's a couple guys in this range that I will be looking at. I think mostly once we get into the next range, it really flattens out, and I'm fine with most of them. But at this part of the draft, Luis Garcia Jr. is my first real target at second base. He's somebody who really was not very good for a pretty long time, and that's why people are maybe not that high on him. He had parts of 4 seasons in the majors, did Luis Garcia Jr., 1,245 plate appearances, where he had just a 690 OPS, just a weak bat, didn't do a lot, didn't run a ton either, was just kind of there. But he was so young. He debuted at age 20. That was his age 20 through 23 seasons. If he was just in the minors that time, posting pretty interesting numbers like most 20 to 23-year-olds were, And then if he debuted last year with his 762 OPS, he hit 282 with 18 homers, 22 steals as a 24-year-old over 140 games. We'd be getting very excited about that. And I think we should mostly be focusing on that last season with Garcia Jr. I think that he was continuing to develop. He was just developing in the majors, whereas other guys get to develop in the minors. And I think that Garcia Jr., if you look at his numbers last season, it's really the strikeout rate combined with the barrel rate that get me the most excited. 16% strikeout rate is quite strong. An 8% barrel rate, that's completely a league average mark. Not strong, but totally fine. So if you've got adequate power and you're making a ton of contact, I'm looking at players who are able to do both of that at second base. Nobody else had a better strikeout rate with a barrel rate that good. And of the players who had a barrel rate better than Luis Garcia's 8%, there were only two other second basemen had a strikeout rate in the teens. That was Spencer Horwitz, who is going much later in drafts because he's dealing with injuries right now, and also Ketel Marte. So a combination of making a lot of contact and having at least average power, that's pretty rare. And then you throw in the fact that he steals 22 bases as well for a Nationals team that really likes running. I think Luis Garcia is young on the upswing of his career and already does some of everything. There's worries about, his ability to hit lefties. He might get platooned a little bit, something like that. That's fair. But the talent, I think, is really there with Luis Garcia. And he's exactly in that stage of his career where I want to be taking some chances.
Perfectly said. I think if you're a roto player, this is exactly the kind of guy you want to target in the middle rounds. He's not going to hurt you in any of the 5 categories. He's actually going to help you in batting average and in stolen bases. Runs, he also could potentially help you a little bit. RBI, home runs, probably about average there, but you're getting 3.5 or 4 solid categories from a guy going around pick 130 at a fairly weak position. There's a bit of a range there. Even just in a 25 draft sample size between 105 and 179. So drafters are not totally sold on him. There's a bit of a big gap there, but if you're getting him anywhere close to that max, anywhere in the 160s, 170s, I think that's a great bargain. And even in the 130 or even a little bit ahead of that range, I've made no secret about how I don't like second base this year. If I can lock down one of these top 10 guys and not have to really worry about it, especially in those more shallow formats, if you guys are playing Yahoo leagues, where there's no middle and corner infield targets, it does change the calculus a little bit. But if you can just take one of these elite targets, one of the guys in the top 10, and then don't have to worry about it, that is something that I really like to do. Marcus Semien is another guy with a massive range, again, just in 25 drafts, but 68 is the minimum, 133 is the maximum. He is an accumulator, and people worry as he gets older if he'll be able to stay on the field as much as he has been, which has been a remarkable run over the last half decade or so of missing maybe a half dozen games. Do you think that continues in 2025, Erik?
I don't think it would be a particularly smart bet to assume that somebody in his age 34 season is going to continue to have some of the highest plate appearance totals in baseball. You look at over the last 4 years, he's reached 724, 724, 753, and 718 in plate appearances. Actually, go to the 2 full seasons before that, obviously skipping over 2020, he was over 700 in those 2. I'm just looking at how much of a lead does he have over the rest of the field in terms of plate appearances. Over the last 4 years, he's at 29-19. Nobody else is in the 2900s. Nobody else is in the 2800s. Second in plate appearances over those 4 seasons is Vlad Jr. at 2783. So just eyeballing that, it's about 136 plate appearances short. It's about an average of, 30 plate appearances per season, less than Semien. Semien's way an outlier here, is my point. And do you really think that he's going to continue being an incredible outlier in his age 34 season? I don't think the Rangers think that either. They were already talking about back in December. We had a note at RotoWire. The manager Bruce Bochy is considering giving Semien more off days in 2025. I'd be considering that as well. The guy's OPS slipped to 699 last year. It was his first year with a below average batting line over a full season since 2018. Marcus Semien is wearing down because he's playing all the time. And the only reason he's such a fantasy asset is that he's playing all the time. When he has a more normal workload, he's going to be a fine player, but he's not going to be the Marcus Semien we're used to. I don't think he makes any sense at all as a target because you could see this collapsing. I mean, what if his playing time falls off a cliff because he finally gets hurt for the first time in forever. You can't assume that just because he hasn't been hurt recently that that's an impossibility. So there's a world in which his value collapse, and I don't see a world in which he really goes much beyond where he is now. Maybe he stays healthy, he keeps compiling, he returns good enough value for where you drafted him. But man, the downside here is way more clear than the upside.
I'd have to agree. Like, I debated him in TGFBI in the 8th round. The lineup is still so good, and I think even if he can play like 130, 140 games, it's still probably a good price. It was like I want to say it was 112 or 115. I was kind of debating it, but I didn't go that route. And I think that I can kind of live a little bit later on. I agree with the worries. I didn't even see the blurb that you guys had that he's going to looking to be sitting some more this season. So that's immediately a bit of a concern because the actual numbers themselves have definitely been trending downwards since that year in Toronto, where he, I believe, set the record for a home run by a second baseman in a season. He was brilliant in Toronto that year, but he has kind of been, you wouldn't really notice it necessarily just looking at the standard box scores because he still plays so much, but Semien is not who he once was, and I think that he is better left as a fade than as a target. You mentioned the allure of the second base, third base eligibility with Jordan Westberg. Does that interest you with Luis Rengifo with the Angels? Really good source of batting average. He stole a lot of bases last season. Not a ton of power, but a lineup that is not terrible in Los Angeles, I want to say, tentatively. I mean, a lot of it depends on what Mike Trout does if he's able to stay healthy. But Luis Rengifo, I find, I think he's a pretty decent target. You can put him in the second, third, middle, corner, infield spots. What do you think about Rengifo, Eric?
It would interest me in theory, but I think he's just going at the wrong tier. I just view him much more similarly to guys going a little bit later, like, say, a Bryson Stott or a Nico Horner, maybe Andres Jimenez. He's not that far ahead of those guys, but he's a little bit ahead of them because, like them, he doesn't hit the ball that hard. In fact, last year, his ability to hit the ball hard somewhat collapsed. He was at a 7.5% barrel rate in 2023. That fell to 2.5% last year. He did make a lot more contact. Just a 14.5% strikeout rate is very good. That helped him hit 300. But even there, he was well ahead of his expected batting average. That was at 262. He just doesn't hit the ball very hard, and he only really ran last year. Now, the Angels did run as a team way more last year, and management's the same, so they're probably going to do that again. But he was at 6 stolen bases in 2022 and 2023, so I'm not counting myself as fully trusting him as a burner yet. Let me just double check his sprint speed because I'm pretty sure it's not particularly high. According to StatCast, if this pulls up by the time I finish this sentence, he was at 37th percentile. Yes, so I'm remembering right. Luis Rengifo is not fast at all. He's just on a team that really likes to run. And again, they might do that again this year. Do you want to put that much faith in it? I don't think that the whole picture, especially when we add in his durability issues, he only played 78 games last year due to injuries, already has been scratched with a tight hamstring, although he's supposed to be back in the lineup soon. So the injury concerns are already there. I just don't think he's that much better than some of the other guys who are going to give you a shot at, a 12-30 type season. I think you can get that a few rounds later. I don't think you need Luis Rengifo.
That's really fair. I honestly had no idea the sprint speed was that bad. That's atrocious. That's like, I can't think of another player who's probably in that range, but that's really, really bad. Ron Washington does like to run a lot, and that will probably help. But combined with the injury concerns, the lack of power, you make a pretty good case to be fading Luis Rengifo. That's that tier taken care of for the most part. I think we can probably move on unless you have anything strong to say about Xander Bogaerts, who I also think is kind of like a Luis Garcia, a really good roto player, probably not somebody that pops as much in a head-to-head format, but just pretty balanced across the board. Do you trust him coming off the injury?
Not fully trust, but I think the price is right for somebody who used to be going way earlier, and you get second/short eligibility. I think is a really nice piece on your roster, but I don't know if there's upside to massively outperform his draft price, and there's downside. He's getting older, but I think he's a chance worth taking to me.
His contract is brutal. His contract is really looking brutal. But we'll see what happens. San Diego's been such a weird team to try and figure out the last few years, acquiring Soto, trading Soto. It was just, I don't really know what to make of them. I know there's been a change in ownership, but kind of a strange team to really evaluate. There's always talk about trading Dylan Cease or trading this guy or acquiring that guy. A bit of a tough team to wrap your head around, but let's keep it going to the 11 through 15 tier, starting with Andres Jimenez, going to Bryson Stott, Luis Arraez, Nico Horner, and Jackson Holiday. For me, this is a tier that I'm not totally sold on. There, I think, are some warts with a lot of these guys. Anybody that stands out to you as a particular target or fade here, Eric?
Well, so this is the tier where I think you're getting the guys who are totally fine. I think if you haven't gotten a second baseman yet, I think you're totally fine with Andres Jimenez. You're totally fine with Bryson Stott, particularly. Those two guys are going to play pretty much all the time. They're not going to hit you a lot of homers, but they're going to get you a good amount of steals, and they're going to be just competent. And Luis Arraez is a target if you're behind in steals, and he's a complete avoid, or sorry, behind in average, and he's a complete avoid if you're in a good spot. Don't turn him down if you do need him. The only one here I think is particularly interesting. I mean, Nico Horner also fits into that Jimenez Stott tier of, you know what he's going to get you, assuming he's healthy and he's going to be fine. Jackson Holiday, I think, is the only one really worth saying anything about. The other guys are just there. And Holiday, I think I would theoretically take a chance, but I haven't actually done it yet. But, if you're getting somebody who was a top prospect in baseball, top 1, top 3, top 5, depending on where you were looking, you get him coming off of one bad season, and he's still only 21. I mean, that upside should still all be there. Yeah. I think getting him as the 15th second baseman off the board, especially in a particularly shallow league, right? If the 15th second baseman off the board in a deep 15-team league, well, that's still somebody starting second baseman. You're not relying a ton on him, but you really did want him to work out. You better pair him with somebody else soon after. But if you're in a shallower league, I would really be taking a look at Jackson Holiday as, say, a last round pick, one of those, right? Because if it works out, if he makes the team, he might not even make the team, right? It could just be Kobe Mayo at third, Jordan Westberg at second, something like that. But if Holiday makes the team, hits the ground running in April, looks like all those prospect reports heading into last season were still accurate. They were just a year early. I think Holiday is the only one in this tier where there's really anything interesting to say about him.
I think that's fair. Yeah, Jimenez, I'm maybe a pessimistic Blue Jay fan. I don't love the trends of the last couple of years. I don't know that he's going to run as much in Toronto, but I think the playing time is there. He's definitely safe from a deeper league perspective. Same goes for Stott. Arraez, you nailed it. If you're really, if you've taken Schwarber and Alonso and you need to kind of boost the batting average back up, then Arraez does make sense. Horner's kind of boring, whatever. But then there's Jackson Holiday, who was this number one generational type of prospect. It seems like the whole Holiday offspring, they all seem like they're going to be fantastic baseball players. Every time I see a clip on the timeline, if it's Ethan Holiday, Jackson, I think there's another one too. Oh, really? It's just an unbelievable gene pool there from Matt Holiday. But I am a little bit not sure what to make of him. There's a part of me that says we should just kind of ignore last season. But there's also some part of me that says, well, what if this is the next Jared Kelenic type of deal? Yeah, I shouldn't really do either extreme. But I think with prospects, a lot of the time, they're these flashy, beautiful players before they make their debut, and then they struggle a little bit, and then they're kind of dead to us. Jackson Holiday probably will be fine. And, some of the struggles last year were probably just due to him being at a young age, trying to adjust to the major leagues. There were certain periods of time where he looked pretty good. Overall, it was kind of rough, but I completely agree with Eric that if you're in, a 12-team league and you're at the very end of your draft and you have only a couple picks left to make, take Jackson Holiday. If things work out, then he might be the next superstar. And we could be talking about Jackson Holiday as a top 75 pick next season if things break out. And it's the point of the draft where you can also drop him, and it won't really kill you to drop your whatever it is, 10th, 12th, 15th round pick at that point. Depending on how deep your league is, it will vary. But especially in those shallower formats, I think Jackson Holiday makes a hell of a lot of sense.
Yeah, it was 60 terrible games last year. But remember, it was a big three of Holiday, Wyatt Langford, and Jackson Chourio. And the first 60 games for Langford and Chourio weren't good either. And Holiday still looked good when he was sent down to AAA. So I think we can you mentioned Jared Kelenic. Certainly worried, but I think that's a worry for 2026, not for this season.
Yeah, like if Wyatt Langford didn't have the September he had, let's say that Jackson Holiday had the September that Wyatt Langford had, hit 8 home runs and stole 6 bases. I wonder if Jackson Holiday's a top 50 pick this year. It's amazing how these little samples can really change your view on a player. And I think it's too soon to be, throwing in the towel on him. He's still, 21 years old? Like it's just way too soon to move on from a guy like Jackson Holiday. But we are going to move on from this tier, though, and talk about the next group of players where I have found myself shopping quite a bit, if I'm being honest. Brandon Lau, Michael Garcia, Jonathan India, Zach Geloff, and Willie Castro. What stands out to you in this group here, Eric?
Yeah, we've got a mix of guys who offer some pretty differing things. I think Lau and Garcia are pretty interesting in opposite directions. I think Brandon Lau's somebody who's had real power for a second baseman. Durability issues, certainly, and not a great park, but having a much better park in Tampa this season. I think this is probably the year to take a shot on Brandon Lau. Michael Garcia, somebody who had a lot of hype heading into last year, looked like he did everything right except lift the ball. And then, well, he didn't really make any progress there last year and got slightly worse in some other ways. But he did improve his strikeout rate, from 22% to 16.5%. Still pounded the ball into the ground. Didn't hit it quite as hard as he did the year prior, but he stole 37 bases despite getting on base at a 281 clip. Obviously, if he gets on base that infrequently again for a Royals team that's getting better, then you got to worry that Michael Garcia has a floor of falling into a utility man. But he's somebody with a really well-rounded skill set in a lot of ways. If he gets a little bit more lift, and we're talking about him, hitting 12 to 15 homers with the rest of his game, there's potential for big upside there for Garcia. So those are two guys I'd be looking at if you want power, Lau. If you want steals, Garcia with some upside, I think, are both those cases.
I've been in on Brandon Lau. I'm in on both of the Lows. Is it Josh Lowe, Brandon Lau? That is one that will always mix me up mentally. But Brandon Lau, here I'm going to do it again. He is somebody that I've always been interested in. Going to the essentially Yankee Stadium, warm Yankee Stadium, should do wonders for him if he's able to stay on the field. I think the Rays as a whole are a really interesting unit if they're able to stay healthy. There are some concerns there with Danny Jansen, with Lau. But Junior Caminero coming up is obviously going to be a boost to that offense, or at least it should be a big boost. And I think that as a whole, that they're a really interesting team to invest in, whether you're talking about any type of fantasy leagues. But I think if you're like doing best balls, the Rays are a pretty interesting team. Jonathan India, somebody that I've been really interested in. I've ranked him aggressively. He's like my 11th or 12th second baseman. I think leaving Cincinnati, I initially saw that as a huge detriment to what would be his value going forward. But Kaufman, I'm going to pull up the StatCast Park factors, but I believe Kaufman was right up close to the top as well. If we're looking back over the past 3 years, Kauffman Stadium is right behind Great American Ballpark, and with a 104 park factor. Great American was 105. So I think the ballpark change might have been something that people overcompensated for a little bit. He stayed healthy last year. He had a 108 WRC plus. He gets on base a hell of a lot, and he's going to be leading off in front of Bobby Witt Jr., Sal Perez, Vinny Pasquantino. I feel like Jonathan India is going way later than he should. Is that a blind spot that I have, or do you think that he actually is a little bit mispriced?
He's one I can't totally figure out. I think you made a great point about that park change not being as terrifying as it might seem. But then we're left wondering just exactly how good is Jonathan India. At least I'm left wondering with that. For many years, we were giving him the excuse that he can't stay healthy. So the fact that his numbers were only decent, well, that's because he couldn't stay healthy. He stayed healthy last year, and he gave us 248 with 15 homers, 13 steals. I mean, it's fine. And in this range of the draft, there's nothing wrong with that. But the excitement that we had for Jonathan India early in his career, where he thought he might actually develop into something who really was moving the needle, I don't know about that. The fact that he's going to be leading off, if he can stay healthy, he's leading off in front of some good hitters. I think he will help you a lot in the runs category while being fine everywhere else. But I wonder, maybe he's somebody who is going to be better off in, points leagues and things like that, where his high walk rate might matter a little more. I think just in terms of roto, he's not going to give you much for batting average. He's not going to give you a lot of homers. He's not going to give you a lot of steals. He's probably going to be one of those sneaky players who adds up to a totally fine earned value. You just can't see him helping anywhere. And maybe I just am not good at drafting that sort of player. I'm just a little bit not sure that the really exciting version of Jonathan India, who once looked like he might be there, I don't know if that's in the realm of possibilities anymore. I think he's kind of just a guy, but I think he's priced okay still.
That's totally a fair assessment. I might be a little bit overly optimistic on him. The home runs are something that'll probably suffer a little bit because while the park factors overall are very similar, that's where there's a big difference is the home run factor in Kaufman versus a Great American. So I took him in Tout Wars, where it's an OBP league. I think that's really a sweet spot for him
Yeah,
because of the
definitely.
on base rate. He's like a 355 on base for his career, I want to say. I did a video a couple days ago. I might be a little bit off, but 352, 355 on base for his career. OBP leagues, points leagues, that's where you push him up. Maybe in standard roto, I'm getting a little bit too optimistic, but somebody that I think is a really strong target of mine this season. My Wi-Fi has been bugging for a while, and I'm frozen here on the camera. So I'm going to tee Erik up for a question about utility man extraordinaire Willie Castro before I do a little refresh here. How interesting is that second, third, short, and outfield eligibility at a 240 ADP, Erik? He was somebody that was a very solid contributor all around the board last season. So what's your interest level in Willie Castro in 2025?
It has not been high enough yet, but I wonder if that is a blind spot. I think of all the stats that have surprised me the most while I've been going over my draft prep this season, as I've been putting together my rankings in the early part of the offseason, the stat that surprised me the most was the fact that Willie Castro came to the plate 635 times last year. I mean, he's Willie Castro. He's just a guy. He's just a utility player. Doesn't seem like the type of player who should be coming to the plate 635 times. And it took him 635 plate appearances just to get to 12 homers and 14 steals and a 247 average. Really just empty plate appearances, as empty as you can get while still being an above average hitter from a real world perspective. He had a 108 WRC plus. He was worth just over 3 wins according to Fangraphs. He just does so little anywhere that the only way he's racking up real fantasy value is by getting to that huge plate appearance total. And do you think he's going to do it again? I mean, that's the bet we have to make here. Willie Castro just being not very impressive in any one way. He's not going to be penciled in as a starter anywhere for an extended period this season, but he can play everywhere, and he plays for a team that's full of injury-prone players. I mean, Byron Buxton, Carlos Correa, just to name a few, Royce Lewis. There's going to be plate appearances available for Willie Castro, but how many weeks this season is it going to be? You know, he's locked in for 6 starts a week. You know that Willie Castro is going to be in the lineup, or is he just kind of going to find his way to, 550 plate appearances, and you're never really sure if you can actually use him this week? But man, the positional eligibility is so tempting on a draft and hold league, just having an option there to fill in at some point somewhere down the line this season. He makes a lot of sense in that way. You're just never, ever going to be excited for him in any given week, I don't think. So I guess the floor is there that he's a useful piece. But, I mean, what if he does just retreat to the 400-ish plate appearances that he's had for most of his career? Are you going to be able to use him in any given week, any year but last year? I just don't know.
Those are totally fair points. I think in DC season, like you said, he was somebody that was a nice target. You have any injury pretty much anywhere on the diamond, you're able to slot him in for a week, and there is some value in that versatility he provides. But the actual production is so volume based, like you've pointed out, that if he is just playing in 100 games or so, there's really not a lot of value to be had in Castro. So I think now that we are kind of into fab draft, waiver draft season, and draft and holds are kind of done for the year, he's somebody that I think the value window has closed a little bit on. Not that I would say I would never take him, but the interest is not as much as it would have been even a month or so ago. Let's move on to this next tier, 21 through 25. Gleyber Torres, Brendan Donovan, Colt Keith, Chris Morel, and Christian Campbell. This is where things start to get a little bit dicey. I think Gleyber Torres and Brendan Donovan are relatively safe late targets at the middle infield spot. But Erik, what are your thoughts on this group here?
Yeah, I don't think this group is much worse than the group before it. I think I've talked about how second base gets pretty flat, and if you have missed out on the early tiers, you can just grab a couple names from ranks 11 through 25 and be fine. I think Torres and Donovan are 2 of the last guys who are at least totally fine. Not excited about them in any way, but wouldn't mind having them on my roster. I think you've got upside, though, with Keith Morel and certainly Christian Campbell. Campbell, one of the top prospects in all of baseball, if he does get the opportunity to start right away, could do a whole lot for the Red Sox this year. And he's still coming at a suppressed price because we don't know that he's going to make it right away. There's a lot of other talents on that Red Sox infield he has to work his way past. I like taking a shot on him, maybe in, paired with a boring second baseman. If you missed one of the early guys, you could go Bryson Stott and Christian Campbell, or Gleyber Torres and Christian Campbell. I also like taking a shot on Colt Keith, or maybe even Christopher Morel as well. I think Colt Keith has an interesting combo of the playing time should really be there, right? He's got some compiler potential to him. It shouldn't be very hard to carve out a large role in Detroit, and he's got youth on his side. He wasn't great last year, but it was just his age 22 season. So Colt Keith, young with some upside and still cheap. And then Christopher Morel, man, I was all over him last year. Somebody who does everything right except for make contact. And then he started making more contact in the early part of the season with the Cubs. Had some really bad BABIP luck, meant it didn't show in a better batting average. But after Morel was dealt to the Rays, that contact just evaporated. And so I'm pretty worried for a player who's got some strengths, but also some flaws. That's the sort of player that the Rays deploy, 3-4 times a week in the perfect matchups, but just not often enough for us in fantasy purposes. So I like him, but I'm pretty worried that the role just isn't going to be there for Morel. Really good range, though, full of guys to take shots on.
Yeah, I think the price is right. Morel last year burned me in Tout Wars because I needed some power and some speed. And the league I'm in is saves plus holds. It's innings pitched instead of wins. It's obviously on base percentage. So I was interested in Morel, and I acquired him from Carlos Marcano from Baseball Prospectus, and I traded him Juan Duran, which I know sounds egregious on the surface, but it's saves plus hold.
Yeah.
But it still was pretty bad. I think Carlos got the better of me on that one, unfortunately. I'll get you back this year, buddy, but you definitely took that one from me. Colt Keith is interesting. Gleyber Torres is interesting. Donovan is a bit of a utility option. These are the guys at this range of the draft where if they're your starting second baseman, I think you've messed up. I think you've waited a little bit too long, 12, even 15 team leagues. If you're starting Brendan Donovan or Colt Keith, in the middle infield spots, that's totally fine. But I think if you are punting the position, you should probably – what's the cutoff for you, Eric, in terms of starting second baseman? Is it just that 15th spot in a 15-team roto, or are there guys like Lau, Garcia, India? Would you be comfortable starting any of those guys at second base, jumping back up to the previous tier? Where's that cutoff for you?
I think the absolute cutoff would be the last guys who are playing every day. So I think the absolute cutoff is still going to be somebody around this Gleyber Torres range, maybe even somebody in the next tier, Jake Cronenworth. I mean, you're not happy about it, but you at least have somebody who's going to be in the lineup all the time. I do try to be as flexible as I can. So I don't necessarily have that clear line of, if I don't get one of these guys, I'm really in trouble. If I didn't get one of the top 15 second basemen, well, I had an extra player that other people didn't have in that early part of the draft. I better have had a good reason to have not grabbed my first second baseman until now. But there are still guys, as long as there's still guys who are in there all the time, they can be really boring, like Jake Cronenworth. But as long as I at least have someone in there all the time, I think I'd be happier with him in some ways as my second baseman than I would with some of these guys who we talked about earlier, who we like, but whose playing time is less assured. I think those are guys you want as a middle infielder, or, as a second baseman paired with a Cronenworth type in the middle infield, just to make sure you're actually going to have someone.
That totally makes sense. I think we've covered most of our actual big targets and fades in this early group. Just stretching it out beyond pick 25 here, where it's Jake Cronenworth, Thairo Estrada, Jose Caballero, you have Hyesung Kim, Dylan Moore. Anybody in this range or beyond that you have any interest in speculating on this year?
Well, I mentioned Cronenworth as that stopgap for if you really got screwed over. He's totally fine. He had a 656 plate appearances last year, 105 WRC plus. He's not an exciting player, but he's going to be there a lot, going to give you good run and RBI numbers. I don't know why he's this affordable. Thairo Estrada, like him as a bounce back in Colorado this year. If somebody's going to play every day in Colorado, they don't have to be that good. I think Estrada clears the bar. Hyesung Kim is interesting, but I'm really worried about the playing time. There's talk about him maybe starting the year in the minors. I think he can give you a good batting average and maybe run, but I just don't know if the playing time's there. But the guy I like is actually just outside this tier, 31, Gavin Lux. Why is Gavin Lux not in the top 30? Gavin Lux, I think, might actually be pretty good, and now he's in Cincinnati, and he's going to be able to play. Lux is somebody who had a swing change in the middle of last season. Basically, he just decided to hit the ball harder, and it worked. He struck out far more, but his barrel rate went way up. Gavin Lux is somebody who was a huge prospect, quite a long time ago at this point, maybe 6-7 years ago, but he was not just supposed to be a useful player. He was supposed to be a future star. I don't know if that's still in there, but he's only 27 years old, and he's now on a roster that is much less crowded than the Dodgers. Certainly, there are good players in the Reds. We've talked about them having a couple too many guys in the past, but it's going to be a lot easier to carve out 550 plate appearances, 600 plate appearances on the Reds. A lot better park as well. And I'm willing to buy into that swing change in the middle of last year, unlocking some of that potential that we all thought was going to be there with Gavin Lux. So I'm not sure why you can get him. We're just looking at the last 2 weeks, right? This is the draft price I would expect before the trade. I do not understand why you can get Gavin Lux here. I'd have him easily 10 spots higher on the second base rankings, at least around that Gleyber Torres, Brendan Donovan tier, if not higher. I mean, I'd be considering him around Jonathan India. Unless, am I way overestimating the playing time here?
No, I think that he is probably not going to play a lot against lefties. I think he's probably more of a strong side platoon bat, but that still should mean 120 some odd games for him. I'm just going to pull up roster resource and see where he's slotted in, but I believe it's as a strong side platoon at second base, which is what they have, and they have him slotted into the 5th spot in the order right now. If that ends up coming to fruition, that could be really huge for Gavin Lux. I like the point about how they're not as crowded as the Dodgers are, which has been part of the problem for Gavin Lux. Cincinnati has been described as being crowded in the infield, but Spencer Steer's already banged up. And, last year we said the same thing about how the Reds were so crowded, and then they ended up having Santiago Espinal playing meaningful time. So you never know with injuries. I think Gavin Lux is a really smart bet to make at this point of the draft. The ballpark is good. He seemed to really figure things out in the second half of last year. And how much of that is the Dodgers and how much of that is Gavin Lux, I don't know. But I think this is a great range to take a chance on him. But Eric, I think that just about wraps it up. I just want to ask you one last question. Out of the entire second base pool, if there's one player that you are telling yourself and your listeners and readers, I want to leave every draft with this guy, or as many as possible. And then one guy that you're saying, I am avoiding him at all costs. There's nothing I could do to draft player X. Who do you think those 2 players would be for you? I know I'm putting you on the spot here a little bit, but.
Yes, good question. I think that I'm just looking at who I have drafted the most at second base, which seems like the only honest way to answer this question. I can tell you that I'm trying to get someone else, but it is Luis Garcia. I think Luis Garcia Jr. has the upside to fit right in with some of those top 5 hitters. I talked about how he's got league average power and a lot of contact, and he's still at that part of his career where he's on the upswing. I really like Luis Garcia. He's the one I've landed on most. Jordan Westberg second, but I've been using him as a third baseman. So he's the main one I'm looking at. As far as avoids, I mentioned all the yellow to orange, maybe even red flags with Luis Rengifo. I think he's just a tier too soon. I think you can get that 12-30 potential with guys like Bryson Stott, Andres Gimenez a little bit later in the draft. So I guess he'd be the earliest guy that I'm behind the market on. Maybe Matt McClain as well. We talked about I just want to see it first, and I'm not sure that I'm willing to take him inside the top 100 like we have to. So there's a couple guys there for you.
That's beautiful, Eric. You do a fantastic job at RotoWire, and I want to let you just tell everybody who's listening where they can keep track of your work, whether it's on the podcast or the written side or social media. Plug away, my friend.
Yeah, you can find me on Twitter at Erik_Halterman. That's Eric with a K. You can find my written work at RotoWire.com. I write the MLB barometer and some other stuff during the off season. You can listen to me on the RotoWire Fantasy Baseball podcast. I host the Thursday guest episode and the Saturday episode with Ryan Boyer. That will be the pickups during the week. And you can also hear me on Sirius XM Radio, host a total of 3 shows there a week. So lots of different places to hear my voice.
Lots of stuff. Eric, I still can't believe you got Garrett Crochet in the 7th round of that draft in Arizona. It's something that I have never been able to get out of my mind. I know that it wasn't like a high-stakes league or anything, but I remember walking into that draft room and seeing, is that Garrett Crochet in the 7th round? I think I walked up to you and said, that is fantastic. And now he's a 2nd-round pick, so that one I think should pay dividends for you for sure. But make sure you are keeping track of everything that Eric is doing. He is doing tons of podcasts. I can relate as somebody who's doing 2 or 3 a day myself this time of year. Eric is putting in the work. So make sure you're following him at Erik_Halterman and keeping track of the RotoWire pod feed. It's one of my favorites. There's all kinds of different voices. You get Jeff Erickson, you get Fred Zinke, you get James, you get Erik Halterman, you get a ton of great people. So make sure you are subscribing over there and check out the site, because RotoWire is also one of the absolute go-to sites. We are going to be back next week talking either third base or shortstop. I never know which way to order those. Different people want to go second, third, short. Some people want to go second, short, third, and go around the diamond. We'll figure it out. Either way, we'll have a position preview for you guys next week if you want to follow along with my work. Joe Orrico 99 on the various socials, the Twitters, and the Blue Skies of the world. But until next week, everybody, take care. Have yourselves a great night.